We are in 1 Peter, starting at verse 3. Honor widows who are truly widows. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. Now command these things as well, that they may be without reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Now let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband, and having a reputation for good works. If she has brought up children, has shown hospitality, and washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, and has devoted herself to every good work. But refuse to enroll younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry, and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. Now, besides that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, and not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander, for some have already strayed after Satan. Now, if any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. Father, we take your word. We know that you gave these words to Paul some 2,000 years ago, and they might seem a bit archaic to us, but the principle's still the same. Care for those who have truly needs. So, Father, give us wisdom. Help us to hear your word. Help it to go into our hearts and spread to all that we do for the glory of Christ. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Please have a seat. Now, my voice is at a bit of a disadvantage in the sense that the cold that has been a part of my life and many of your lives for the last week or so has always settled in the voice. And the voice is getting better, but it hasn't tried to speak for 30 minutes. And you might say, well, that's good. Maybe you could shorten it a bit, and I will try very much to do so this morning. But as typical, I don't know if I know how. And so back in chapter 3, we learned right around verse 15, I believe, that the great purpose of this letter from Paul to his beloved spiritual son was to tell the church through their new pastor, Timothy, how they ought to conduct themselves in the household of God. So we've had many lessons so far, and I won't retrace them. But we're coming up on chapter 5 and the first 2 verses of chapter 6, where we're talking about 3 groups of people that the church is called, in some sense, to address and care for and instruct. They are widows, which we'll deal with today. Next week is elders. And then finally, Charlie, I believe, if he's going to carry through with 1 Timothy chapter 6 on the last day of the year when we gather on New Year's Eve for worship, he's going to deal with the issue of slaves. And I'm sure he's going to modernize it into employers and employees. But somehow that will be done by the grace of God. And so we're going to deal with widows today and caring for them. And Paul says some very interesting things, like who is truly a widow, when we, by definition, understand who a widow is. A widow is somebody who's lost their husband. Widowers are somebody who's lost their wives. And so it seems quite clear to us that widows are widows and widowers are widowers. But Paul defines them in 4 different groups, and he addresses each one of them, and some of them are not to be helped at all. That seems rather harsh, especially in our ears today. And so we're going to talk about those 4 groups in just a minute. Now, after the new year, we're going to take up a series over the course of the year, actually, on worldviews. what we're hearing from the world, and what does the Bible say about it. And we're going to start in January with saying a couple sermons or messages on who God actually is, because you have to have that foundation to understand worldviews. And is there really truth, absolute truth, and where does it come from? And then every month afterwards, once a month, we're going to have a particular topic like the dignity of human life. We're going to have that topic once a month as we talk about various worldviews and how they often clash with biblical views of the world. So we look forward to that series. It's meant to help life groups also have a curriculum after each of those messages once a month, that they can go deeper and deeper into the topic at hand, okay? And so let's talk about widows. Paul will complicate things by instructing us not only about these four groups, but about what to do and what not to do with them. And so we're going to make some sense out of this. This is a lesson on caring. I don't know how you'd want to define caring, but I see it as kind of a compassionate interest in the welfare of others. You see Philippians chapter 2, where Paul clearly writes to the Philippians that they're supposed to think of the interest of other people, not just their own interest. So there's a sense of here getting out of our selfish, self-centered, natural selves and becoming a lot more like Jesus Christ with our new lives and the Spirit of God within us, giving us a new capacity to love and care. I was in a McDonald's on our way home. I shouldn't admit that, but I was. And I was with Missy and Caden, and exit 91 on the way to Columbus, almost there. But we stopped to get some food, and we're in the lobby. We make our order. We move over. We wait for our food. We get our food. I take one step this way, then another step, and my feet go up. And my back crashes down, and my head hits the floor with a pretty good bang. And I'm laying there, actually thinking, all right, what just happened? And I'm laying there for just a moment, then I sit up, and I'm wondering, okay, when's it going to hit? Aneurysm in the brain or something, right? But in the end, I bypassed all of that by the grace of God, no concussion from what I can tell. And I praise the Lord for that very, very much, especially at my age. But what was fascinating to me, and it didn't really anger me, maybe for a second, but it really didn't anger me, but it was kind of a study in our modern day culture. Not one person, one employee or one customer, little old man Mike, said a thing, tried to help, cared. I don't know what's going on. It's hard to read the minds and hearts of everybody, but it was kind of a surprising moment, a lesson, and it fit into the sermon, so that's why I'm saying it today. And so the experience of caring is really a topic that the church needs to take most seriously, because we are called to care for the needs of other people, especially in the church, not to be cold-hearted to the world outside these walls. But in Galatians 6, it says we're really supposed to take care of the church family first, but also care for the people outside. And so it's any wonder today that we have coming up this week a chance to take care of a family in many different ways who is suffering the loss of a mom, a wife, and a grandma. And the church will have a service, not in the church, but at the funeral home. And then we'll have hopefully a very delightful lunch afterwards where people can commiserate and support each other. But I want to explain to you that in chapter 5, in Ephesus, in the first century of the church, things were radically different than they are today. We can hear Paul say, do not enroll anybody who's under the age of 60 in the care of widows in the church. Well, somebody could come up to you and say, I'm not 60 yet, but I will be next month. Well, you may have serious needs now, but you're just going to have to tough it out until we're ready to enroll you at the age of 60. Is Paul saying we have to be hard and true on all of these things that he says, in spite of the fact he doesn't mention it anywhere else in the scriptures? So we have to remember this is first century. We're 21st century. And things were different then than they are now. Let me give you a couple examples. The most at-risk people in not only the Middle East, but probably across the globe at that time, were widows, orphans, and aliens. Aliens meaning immigrants, people who aren't part of the country they're living in at that moment. Widows didn't have a husband. Orphans didn't have parents. And aliens didn't have a home. And so these are the most at-risk people. And God is profoundly moved to say to us constantly that he cares for the widows and the orphans and the aliens, and we ought to as well. Now today, the more at-risk people, and it changes from nation to nation, culture to culture, are a lot different than what they used to be. Yes, widows still matter and orphans and so on, but the most at-risk people are kind of, at least in my heart today, those who are traveling to our nation from the South. And I just heard a report that 100,000 children who have crossed the borders, been much more than that, but 100,000 children are unaccounted for. How at risk can that get? Women describing how they've been violated time and time again on this journey to our country. Now, whatever you think about immigration, put it aside. If they're here, they're greatly at risk for constant abuse and misuse, as we could probably delve into most earnestly. Now, see, I've gone too long already on that point. I must quicken the pace. The second thing I would say is there's no safety net for a Christian widow with no family at that time except the church. That's the only help she could really expect. Now, just imagine again, you're talking about a widow who has no children and no grandchildren, no nieces and nephews, uncles, and so on and so forth. Certainly no immediate family. And this widow would have been terribly at risk in that culture. Paul doesn't speak about this in any other letter. And so we ought to take what he says here, not with a grain of salt, but with an understanding. He's describing a situation in the church in Ephesus. And each church might have a slightly or a largely different set of problems going on, a different set of needs. And then finally, remember, as I've already said, it's in God's heart, should be in our heart, to meet the real needs of one another. Psalm 68:5, Father of the fatherless, protector of widows, is God in his holy habitation. James 1:27, Jesus' half-brother says, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. So the one thing we do have in common, maybe a couple other things is, well, actually, let's say two. One thing we have in common with the church in Ephesus 2,000 years ago is it's a church and we're a church, all right? So the principles for the church will apply of caring for one another. And second, there will always be extreme needs within any church that is a part of this planet in a fallen world. So we must be ready to respond with compassionate hearts. Now let's describe these four widows and see if we can make some sense out of them. The first one, found in verse 3, is widows who are truly widows. It's a weird way of saying things. And so what does he mean? I'll get to the word honor in just a minute. Who are these widows who are truly widows? Well, it's kind of answered in verses 4 and 5 for us. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household, meaning the children and the grandchildren. And then in verse 5, she who is truly a widow is left all alone, has nobody to bank on. Nobody can help her. And that's where the church needs to step up. So widows without family are truly needy widows. Remember the culture at that time. It's not always the case today that women who are widows are truly in this desperate of a situation. In fact, it might be far more rare in our country anyway than we realize. Many people are taken care of through many different types of help, whether it be Medicare, Medicaid, disability, retirement funds, and it goes on and on. So often, although a sad event, the death of a husband, widows will have the ability to carry on in life. Now, the word honor, which is going to be used again in the issue of elders, starting in verse 17, the word honor here means proper respect and provision. Proper respect and provision. Jesus talked about this in Matthew 7 when he was confronting the Pharisees who were making a big deal out of James here, eating a meal without washing his hands first. How dare he? Our mothers all taught us this. Why is James doing this? And it seems Jesus' apostles or disciples were not washing their hands before they ate. And it seems like a big deal germ-wise, but it's probably not a big deal spiritually. But the Pharisees are making it a big deal. That's what they did. They make a ceremony out of washing their hands. And so Jesus says, but aren't you the same, I'm paraphrasing by the way, aren't you the same guys who teach that you can tell James here, who's got a mom and a dad who are in financial need, that they don't have to help mom and dad if they say the funds that would go to taking care of mom and dad are dedicated to the Lord. It's called Corban. And so if James had a hard, sorry to pick on you, James. You're good, man. You can handle it. Big shoulders. But if James had a hard, cruel heart and didn't want to take care of mom and dad for whatever reasons, then he could say, well, what I would give to you, mom and dad, is Corban. It's dedicated to God, and I can't take that back. And so he'd get out of the responsibility of caring for mom and dad. Jesus says this is not honoring mom and dad as the fifth commandment says, to take care of mom both with respect and with provision. And so truly the widows are those who have no family and have no expectation of getting help from anywhere except as a Christian from the church. One other point Paul makes about a real widow is that she has her hope in God. He describes a woman who is, yes, desperate, yes, in need. The church needs to step up and help. But this is a woman who's showing that her real dependence is not on a church. It's on God. Her hope is in him who says he will care for widows and orphans. Psalm 146:9, the Lord upholds the widow and the fatherless. So those are widows who are truly needy. Second class of widows that he talks about are widows with family who are expected to be cared for by their family. I think this happens a lot in our country. I really do. Whether you're a believer or a non-believer, whatever your background might be, I think most families, to one degree or another, take care of mom and dad when they have real needs. Mom and dad might still be at home. My in-laws are wonderful. They're 85 and 84. They're still very independent. They serve in the church. They love the Lord. They entertain us, and so on and so forth. They're well taken care of by the Lord. But there may come a day when they have real needs, and the family needs to step up. So if there are widows in our church who have family members, children and grandchildren, the responsibility is not the church to take care of those widows. It's the responsibility especially of a Christian family who has a mom or a dad in need and help in their age. So the societal expectation in Paul's day was to care for mom and dad. It was not even a question. Yes, there were knuckleheads who wouldn't do it, hard-hearted, mean-spirited siblings and grandchildren who don't like mom and dad for whatever reason and certainly don't want to give their money to mom and dad. But you and I must remember that culture is families lived generationally together. Moms and dads had their kids got married and had their kids. Usually they all lived in the same household. And they would have a chance to care for moms and dads and grandparents. And so Paul says sternly in this passage that a Christian who fails to help their family is worse than a non-believer. I mean, what's worse than a non-believer? How would you answer that? I thought about it. I mean, non-believer is not in good shape, spiritually especially. What's worse than a non-believer? And I don't know that it gets any worse. But Paul's clearly being over the top to make his point. You who say you are Christians have been redeemed. You've been filled with the Spirit. You've been given the fruit of the Spirit, which starts with love, kindness, gentleness. What is wrong with you? If you who say you are Christians are taking care of mom and dad in their old age, then how can you even say you are? You're worse than non-believers. And Paul has a way of being harsh to make his point. Now, I understand in our day and age, helping aging parents is radically different. We do have Medicare. We do have retirement funds. We do have assisted living. We do have even when dementia or Alzheimer's hits, we have care facilities for that. Very expensive stuff, I'll grant you. But in the end, we do have these facilities that often are necessary for us to take care of our aging parents. But in the end, the responsibility is the families, especially a Christian family. But now, if there is ever a need, certainly a church could and would hopefully step up. So Paul's simply saying, don't act like a selfish son or daughter who doesn't consider their parents as a worthy sacrifice of time, money, and energy. Be Christ-like in your love. Third kind of widow is widows who are on a list, who are enrolled because they're needy, and voila, they still have a lot of youthful energy to serve. They might be 60 or over, but they still got guns blaring. They're ready to serve people in the church, ministries in the church, one another. My in-laws are just like that. They still serve. They're not out there playing golf all the time in their retirement. So it says, first of all, 60 or older. I don't know how to make sense of that, quite frankly. It may have been kind of the unknown or unspoken kind of level of, boy, you're really old if you're 60, and it may be true, right? I'm way past 60 now, but you might be really old if you're 60. And in the end, the idea here is if you're 60, obviously you've reached a point in stature in society where you're considered retired, old age, and so on. Even priests in the temple retired at the age of 50 because the lifespan was radically different. And so here we're living much longer than they did back then. Or possibly Paul, the good Jewish Pharisee that he was, understood what the Mishnah wrote from rabbis, teaching that 60 is that age of old age. And so that's a good age to say it starts here. You can enroll a widow at the age of 60, but not sooner. And I'm sure they had some leeway on that. Now, Paul lists, after saying that in verse 9, that there are 8 kind of qualifications, virtues of a woman. 60 is one of them. Whether that's a virtue or not, you decide. But there were 8 qualifications Paul mentions, and I don't need to go through them at all, but they kind of demonstrate a person who is humble, has a servant's heart, and isn't looking to take it easy. They want to serve. And so you have people who've got a reputation, first of all, of having done good works. That's their reputation. You know them. I would say that's my in-laws. And then if she has brought up children, shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, cared for the afflicted, has devoted herself to every good work, it's all showing action. And they've been very busy. They haven't thought just of themselves. They're not self-indulgent, as he describes those who are truly not widows, even though they are widows. And so this list, what are we to make of it? Are we to have a list in our church? I don't think so, but this list was very helpful. Acts chapter 6, Greek widows weren't being fed properly by the early church. So what did? They chose deacons. The deacons probably created a list of Greek widows who were born again in the church in Jerusalem, so they know who they had to take care of. So I think this list has grown since the beginning of the church to include what Tertullian, if you know about him, at the end of the 2nd century, called an order of widows. It's kind of like having a new ministry in the church. We have the order of widows. And the widows were very much interested not only in praying, but they had the energy to do a lot of different ministries in the church. And so this is possibly that kind of list that Paul is describing in the early days of the church. Widows who are on this list are needy. They will have received financial help, but they are so in strength, willing to serve the church, that you put them on a list of those who are serving and receiving. And then finally, you have these young widows. Boy, does he say a lot about these young widows, which could get us all in trouble very quickly. But he begins by saying that these younger widows ought not to be enrolled. Young widows are those who can marry and still raise a family. And that's Paul's prescription, his remedy for young widows. It's not to get online with a dating service necessarily. It's not to, as a great preacher I really love has said, to wait a couple years before you even consider marrying somebody else. And that has some wisdom, but back in these days, it's like you're a young widow, you have no family. The best thing you can do right now is find a man to marry. Oh, yes, you want to find a good man, not a rabble-rouser, not a drunk, not an addict, not a kind of guy who's going to be abusive, but you want to find a husband. And it seems rather rapidly. You can't exist being a widow for long. And so he worries about the condition of a widow, the time on her hands. I know, again, this all sounds rather squirmy to us. How dare Paul say that kind of thing? But he's saying in that culture at that time, if you were married and you had children, you were a very busy woman. You're not only raising the kids, you're taking care of the household. And you were meeting all the needs that are around you, including parents and grandparents. And so it was a very busy life. But if you were a young widow, meaning you didn't have any kids, then the best thing you can do for yourself is find a husband. I don't know if the church was a matchmaking service. I could try to help anybody who wants some help. But in the end, I just think that the idea, and it makes some sense, is if you're vulnerable and in great need, the best result for you is to get married and have some children and go about life in a busy manner rather than being idle and having time on your hands. Your husband's gone. You don't know what you're to do. You're not going to have a career because women didn't have careers back then. And so instead of being a busybody and getting people's business, because of all this time, get married and use your time well. Did I get in trouble? I hope not. It's Paul's words, not mine. Martin Luther, when he was a Catholic priest and then left the priesthood because he became what we call a Protestant today, there were a group of nuns who also were following the Protestant way. So they were leaving the nunnery or whatever it was called. And they were being matched up with men in the Christian faith. And so they were getting married. And there was one left. And Martin Luther wasn't married. And so instead of courting and dating and finding out if you feel all fuzzy and warm about the person, he said, I'll marry her. And he did. And they had a reasonably happy marriage for many, many years. And so a young woman, she wasn't a widow, but she left the nunnery, single. Occupation was not there for her. He married the woman partly out of kindness and duty, but also because he was now freed from the limits of priests. Now, Paul states in verse 16 real clearly that the purpose of this lesson was not to overburden the church. Timothy, you're falling into a situation in Ephesus which seems quite clear that there are problems with serving widows. They don't know what to do. I'm going to give you some guidelines. I think you need to follow these guidelines. And this is something that we're going to do so you're not burdening the church. Everybody seems to expect something from the church. Every widow, by the way, whether they had family or not. Paul's saying, no. Imagine how difficult that is. Oh, you're 59. Come back next year. Oh, you don't have any groceries. You're young. Huh? Do you have family? Yeah, I have a mom and dad, and so we'll go see them. It seems rather cut and dry. But Timothy's in a situation where people didn't know what they should do and manage in light of these difficulties. So let me ask a couple questions in application. One would be, what pleases God? I see that in the first few verses when you look at the fact that if a widow has children, then the great thing to do that is godly is to manage and care for those who are widows. And this pleases the Lord. So what pleases God? I mean, that's our great goal in life. It's impossible to please God without faith. Our whole duty is to not only enjoy him and glorify him, but is to please him. That's why we attempt to lead a life that has far and far less sin. That is why we try to be faithful and dutiful in church. That's why we try to meet the needs of one another, because it pleases God. He met our needs all the time. We need oxygen when we come out of mom, so he provides oxygen all the time. We need food. He provides it. It goes on and on. So what pleases God? First of all, I would say in the context, a family that cares for elderly parents. Very pleasing to God in the Christian church. Again, there's modern ways of going about this. I've seen too many people over time truly care for their parents. So I don't think this is a huge issue. But I do hear that at times it is such a burden, financially, time-wise. And so there's much need to make sure that we are in prayer and not losing our hearts towards our families. So we must be aware, though, also that society is put in such a lesser importance on aging people. In Canada, they would allow some of this to happen, where if a parent was in dementia and was still had their wits a bit, they could say, I want to be euthanized. And the government of Canada would do that. And yet that sounds like a very utilitarian decision to make. The parents aren't going to be anything. They're in Alzheimer's or they're in dementia, but it's not necessarily the right thing to do. It's not the dignity of a human life. So we care for them. Second thing about what pleases God is a Christian who has needs and hopes in God. What I mean by that is this widow that is mentioned at the beginning has this idea that she is truly a widow, left alone, has set her hope on God. I mean, the one way to really see a person who's most earnest about their faith is when life gets difficult and almost overwhelming, who are they trusting? The government, the church, or God first? So 1 Peter 5:17 or 5:7, casting all our anxieties on him because he cares for you. Do you understand the concept that God is Father? He cares for you, truly cares for you and me. And so it's all right to go to him frequently, knocking on his door, saying, God, my Father, I have these needs, not these wants, these needs. And so to trust that God will meet a true need is surely a sign that we are people of faith and it pleases God. And then what else pleases God is a church that is prepared to provide and to include people who have these needs. And I simply say this, provide is the financial part, but the inclusion is the idea that just because we're older doesn't mean we're done. In fact, Piper says retirement's not in the Bible. A Christian should serve and serve and serve until they just can't anymore. And sometimes the last way we can serve is simply prayer. I used to remember seeing some really older people in my ministry back in Dorseyville, and it was such a blessing to go see them because they were in pain. They were sometimes bent over. Sometimes they ended up being in bed, but they were so joyful and so prayerful. And so a Christian saint, no matter what the age, is to continue in service. And what is the role of the church? That's the second question. First is have a plan in place. We have a mercy ministry. We provide financial help to church family members, of course, sometimes to people who aren't part of our church who knock on our door and say they have needs. You didn't know this was going on, but in the lobby was a couple, and they're having a serious, I will call it a breakdown. I'm not quite sure the issues. And eventually the police came and helped, but we had many saints back there meeting the needs of people they didn't even know, people who could have scared them. But they met the needs of the people there as best they could at this given moment. And so a church needs to have a plan of caring, of financial help, visitation, assisting widows and single moms, and it goes on and on. Second, be prepared to say no. This is the hard part. So people come up to our door, can you help me? Sure. We give $25 gift cards to like Giant Eagle. And if you need gas, you can get gas. If you need food, you can get food or whatever. We find them coming back the next day. Can I have another gift card? No. I also gave you a list of people you could call. And so it feels bad. I really feel bad, especially when I still have the gift cards back there. But there's often this routine of coming back and back without making any changes. And I think what Paul is trying to say here is be prepared to say no. Not because it's easy, but because he doesn't want the church to be burdened when there's family around, especially for widows, to care for them. Third, practice generosity. From your giving, there's money set aside in our mercy fund. Maybe not enough in the end, and maybe that needs to be increased, and we'll always take a look at that. But think of you. There was a need in the Ukraine, really with the Winslows, to buy this van so they could go to the border of Ukraine and pick up refugees and take them to safe places in Poland. I don't know the end result. Is the van still running? I don't know. But you guys are so generous. How much did we raise? Anybody remember? Just in a Sunday, around $26,000. And so generosity, practice it to meet the needs in emergencies. We never know the needs beforehand. The needs pop up. And then finally, our church in its role should never forget the priority is people. Many times now, if you think about it, churches are being run like a corporation. Programs. Let's get some more people in the seats and so on and so forth. And there's a place and a time for everything potentially, but the greatest need of a church is to love one another. That's what Christ said. They will know you are Christians if you love one another. Well, I don't like them today. Okay, but you can still love them. If they have a wound, won't you bandage them? If they haven't had lunch for a week, won't you give them lunch? They may be still rascals, but you're showing love. And so never forget that people are the priority. And sometimes as a pastor, I know this is one of the things that Christ will have a little word or two with me on, is that sometimes I just don't think well enough of the needs of certain individuals in the church. Jesus was concerned that we show love to one another and care for one another, and that is the full duty of a Christian. Let me end by saying, never forget God is a caring God, especially for his children. Certainly he gives all that the world needs for life, even the ones who shake their fist at him. He still provides. Yet he overflows with love and kindness and mercy. Millions of people right now are worshiping or praying to God, and he's hearing every one of them. He knows the details of everyone's prayer and what's going on in their life. He knows these things. Millions at once. And he's going to meet these needs of his children. He's God. And one place where he'll meet the needs is potentially the church. And so we need to be prepared to be a church that meets the needs of those who truly have needs.